It started with the most god-awful crashing sound I'd ever heard, like a pickup truck had decided to redecorate my living room by coming through the front door at 60 miles an hour. 5 a.m. Pitch black outside, the kind of quiet that usually only gets broken by an early bird or the paperboy. This was no bird. This was violence. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped animal, and for a split second, lying there in bed, I thought maybe I was still dreaming, a nightmare spilling into reality. But the second crunch, the splintering of wood, and the unmistakable sickening shriek of a doorframe giving way, that was all too real. Drop a comment right now letting me know where you're watching from, because I guarantee you, this story is going to make your worst HOA nightmare look like a walk in the park. You're about to hear how I went from being a retired civil engineer, quietly enjoying my golden years, to the unwilling star of a pre-dawn home invasion, orchestrated by none other than the self-appointed queen of our little suburban kingdom, Brenda Klump, president of the Harmony Glen Homeowners Association. And it all escalated from a perfectly reasonable refusal on my part, less than 24 hours earlier, to allow her private army into my home. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those deceptively pleasant early autumn days. I was in my workshop, meticulously cleaning the carburetor for my vintage lawnmower, a soothing, methodical task. That's when I heard the distinct, imperious rap on my front door. Not a friendly knock. This was a summons. I already had a sinking feeling. Through the peephole, my suspicions were confirmed. Brenda Klump, in all her polyester tracksuit glory, a particularly offensive shade of puce today, accessorized with too much gold-plated jewelry, stood on my porch, flanked by her two prize bulldogs. Not literal dogs, mind you, but her so-called community standards enforcement officers. A couple of beefy guys, I privately called Big Tony and Skippy. Big Tony looked like he'd lost a fight with a sack of angry badgers and was still mad about it. Skippy was leaner, weaselly, with shifty eyes that never quite met yours. Both wore cheap, ill-fitting navy blue windbreakers with HOA security amateurishly embroidered on the back. They looked less like security and more like extras from a low-budget cop show, the kind where everyone gets their lines wrong. Brenda, however, radiated an aura of supreme confidence, as if she owned not just the HOA, but the very air we breathed. She clutched a clipboard to her chest like a scepter. "Mr. Peterson," she began, her voice dripping with that uniquely condescending sweetness she reserved for residents she was about to steamroll. "We're here for the biannual exterior compliance review and a scheduled internal systems check." I blinked. "Internal systems check?" "Brenda, there's nothing in the CCRs about internal systems checks for detached single-family homes, and you know it. What exactly are you referring to?" I kept my voice calm, polite. I'd learned long ago that engaging Brenda with anything other than factual composure was like throwing gasoline on a bonfire. She thrived on conflict, on making people flustered. "It's a new initiative, Arthur," she said, deliberately using my first name in that overly familiar way that always set my teeth on edge. "For safety, fire hazards, unpermitted modifications. We're being proactive." Skippy, her little shadow, nodded eagerly, his Adam's apple bobbing. Big Tony just grunted, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, probably trying to remember his lines if I pushed back. "Unpermitted modifications?" I raised an eyebrow. "Brenda, the most exciting modification I've made in the last 5 years was changing a shower head. And my smoke detectors are hardwired and up to code. I check them monthly. I appreciate the HOA's concern for safety, but I'm not comfortable with an unscheduled and, frankly, unprecedented internal inspection without a clear written policy distributed to all homeowners detailing the scope and legal basis." I was standing just inside my doorway, the screen door still closed between us, a small, symbolic barrier. Brenda's smile tightened. The puce tracksuit seemed to gleam with a faint, menacing aura. "Arthur, this isn't a debate. It's a requirement. We have cause for concern." "Cause? What cause?" I asked, genuinely baffled. My property was immaculate. My lawn was edged. My azaleas were blooming contentedly. My trash cans were stored discreetly, just as the 60-page Harmony Glen rulebook demanded. She consulted her clipboard with an exaggerated flourish. There's an anonymous report of excessive hedge height on the western boundary. My hedges. My meticulously trimmed, entirely compliant hedges. They were a good 6 inches below the maximum stipulated height. Brenda, my hedges are perfectly fine. You can see them from here. And what does that have to do with an internal systems check? Her eyes narrowed. Refusal to cooperate will be noted, Arthur. It suggests you have something to hide. This was her classic tactic. Insinuation and intimidation. I have nothing to hide, Brenda. I simply value my privacy and my rights as a homeowner. If you have a legitimate, documented concern about a specific external violation, please put it in writing, cite the relevant bylaw, and I'll address it. But you and your associates are not coming into my house on a whim. Big Tony took a half step forward, a low rumble escaping his chest. Skippy actually puffed his out a bit. It would have been comical if it weren't so irritatingly presumptuous. Is that your final word, Mr. Peterson? Brenda asked, her voice now dangerously low. It is, I said, keeping my tone even. Have a pleasant afternoon. I started to close the main door, and that's when she spat. You'll regret this, Arthur. We have protocols for uncooperative residents. This association has rules for a reason. The implied threat hung in the air, thick and unpleasant, like the cheap perfume she wore. I just closed the door, locked it, and went back to my carburetor, though my focus was shot. The whole encounter left a bitter taste. Little did I know that her protocols involved a 5 a.m. home invasion. I spent the rest of the evening feeling uneasy, a knot in my stomach. I reread the HOA bylaws again, just to be sure I hadn't missed some obscure clause that gave them the right to burst into homes. Of course, there wasn't one. What Brenda and her cronies were doing was pure intimidation, a power trip of the highest order. I even double-checked the locks, a small, futile gesture against the impending storm. I never imagined she'd escalate things to the criminal. That was my mistake. Underestimating the sheer audacity of a woman who believed in HOA presidency made her a feudal lord. The evening passed without further incident, and I went to bed, foolishly thinking the worst was a nasty letter or a trumped-up fine. The sheer arrogance, the utter disregard for decency and law, it was breathtaking. And as I lay there in the dark, before the shattering of wood and peace, I remember thinking that Harmony Glen was starting to feel a lot less harmonious. The splintering of my front door, the actual frame buckling inwards, was a sound that seared itself into my brain. It was raw, brutal, and utterly terrifying. One moment, I was in that fuzzy space between sleep and wakefulness. The next, adrenaline was coursing through me like a wildfire. I scrambled out of bed, heart hammering, my mind struggling to process the violence of the noise. For a wild second, I thought it was an earthquake, but then came the shouting, "Ho! Open up! Compliance inspection!" The voices were muffled, distorted by the shattered door, but the intent was clear. This wasn't just a knock. This was a forced entry. Before I could even think to grab my phone or a defensive weapon, not that I owned one, beyond a heavy-duty flashlight, the remains of my beautiful solid oak front door crashed inwards, and silhouettes filled the jagged opening. 2, then 3 figures, bulky and dark against the pre-dawn gloom seeping in from the porch light they'd apparently switched on. My son, Liam, was staying over. He'd driven in late the previous night, a surprise visit. He's a professional MMA fighter, a light heavyweight with reflexes like a startled cat and the calm demeanor of a meditating monk, until provoked. He was sleeping in the guest room, which was closer to the front of the house than my bedroom. The commotion must have woken him instantly. As I fumbled for my glasses on the nightstand, still half-dazed, I heard a different kind of sound from the hallway. Not the aggressive bellowing of the intruders, but a sharp grunt, a thud, and then a surprised yelp. By the time I got to my bedroom door, peering out cautiously, the scene in my foyer was unexpected. Liam, barefoot and in his sleep shorts, was a study in controlled chaos. One of Brenda's goons, it looked like Big Tony, the larger of the two from yesterday, was on his hands and knees, groaning, clutching his ample stomach. Liam wasn't even breaking a sweat. He had apparently met Big Tony's charge with a perfectly executed sidestep and a short, sharp body blow that had folded the bigger man like a cheap suit. The second intruder, who I now recognized as Skippy, the weaselly one, was frozen mid-stride, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror, a flimsy plastic clipboard clattering to the floor from his nerveless fingers. He looked like a chihuahua that had accidentally challenged a lion. Liam hadn't laid a hand on Skippy yet. The man was simply paralyzed by the swift, decisive, and utterly unexpected dismantling of his partner. "Get out of my father's house," Liam said, his voice low and even, but carrying an edge that could cut steel. It was the voice he used in the octagon right before a fight, calm, focused, and promising a world of hurt if compliance wasn't immediate. Skippy, to his credit, found his feet quickly, stumbling backwards towards the gaping hole where my door used to be. Big Tony was still trying to remember how to breathe. Then, from the porch, came Brenda Clump's shrill, furious voice. "What is going on in there? Tony! Skippy! Subdue him! He's obstructing an official HOA action!" She was actually directing them from outside, like a battlefield general safely behind the lines. Liam took a step towards the doorway, and Skippy practically threw himself onto the porch, scrambling away. Liam didn't pursue. He just stood there, filling the frame, an immovable object of calm fury. I finally found my voice, my own anger starting to eclipse the fear. "Brenda, what in the goddamn hell do you think you're doing? You just broke down my door. Arthur Peterson, you were given a lawful order to allow an inspection," she shrieked, her face contorted with rage, visible now in the dim light. "This is outrageous! You will be facing severe penalties for this, and for assaulting my officers." "Assaulting your officers?" I yelled back, stepping into the hallway beside Liam. "They broke into my home at 5 a.m. That's breaking and entering, Brenda. That's a felony." Big Tony was slowly getting to his feet, wincing. He looked thoroughly deflated. Liam hadn't hit him hard enough to cause serious injury, just enough to emphatically neutralize the immediate threat. It was a testament to his training. Use appropriate force. De-escalate. He wasn't a thug. He was a professional. They were performing their duties. Brenda insisted, her voice cracking slightly. She was losing control, and she knew it. The sight of Big Tony wheezing and Skippy cowering had clearly not been part of her grand plan. "Their duties do not include home invasions," I retorted. "Liam, call 911. Report a break-in and assault." My son nodded, already pulling his phone from the pocket of his shorts, where he'd evidently stuffed it. "Brenda," I continued, my voice shaking with barely suppressed rage, "you and your goons are going to jail." Her face went pale under the porch light. The bravado seemed to leak out of her. The puce tracksuit suddenly looked less power statement and more pathetic. Big Tony, now upright but hunched over, muttered something about just following orders. Skippy was trying to make himself invisible behind a porch pillar. The 911 dispatcher was on the line, Liam calmly explaining the situation. "Yes, my father's home has been broken into by individuals claiming to be from the HOA. They smashed the front door down. One of them attempted to assault me. We need police here immediately." He gave our address. The sound of approaching sirens, remarkably quick, was the most beautiful sound I'd heard all morning. Brenda Clump's expression shifted from fury to a dawning, horrified realization that her little kingdom was about to collide with the real world, and the real world had actual laws, not just her petty, self-serving regulations. The HOA cops looked like they wanted the earth to swallow them whole. My door was a ruin, my adrenaline was still pumping, but a cold, hard resolve was beginning to form. This wasn't just going to be a complaint, this was going to be a reckoning. The sight of her, standing there impotently as the blue and red lights flashed nearer, was the first small taste of the justice that was to come. She had underestimated me. and she clearly had no idea who my son was. The arrival of the actual police officers was a scene I'll replay in my mind for years. 2 cruisers, lights strobing, cutting through the pre-dawn murk. Officers Miller and Rodriguez, calm, professional, and looking distinctly unimpressed as they took in the scene. My shattered front door, Big Tony still looking green around the gills, Skippy trying to explain himself with frantic hand gestures, and Brenda Clump attempting to regain her regal composure, though failing spectacularly. Liam and I stood on what was left of my porch, explaining our side. "They kicked the door in, officer," I said, gesturing to the splintered wood and the busted frame. "Said it was an HOA compliance inspection at 5 in the morning." Officer Miller, a woman with tired eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor, looked at Brenda. "Ma'am, is this true? Did you authorize these men to force entry into Mr. Peterson's home?" Brenda puffed herself up. "Officer, Mr. Peterson was refusing a legitimate HOA request for an internal systems safety check. We had reason to believe there were hazardous conditions. My community standards officers were acting under my authority to ensure the safety and compliance of Harmony Glen." Her voice was a little too loud, a little too defensive. Officer Rodriguez, a younger man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, was examining the doorframe with a flashlight. "Reason to believe? What specific reason did you have for this specific house, at this specific hour, requiring this level of entry?" he asked, his tone neutral but firm. Brenda faltered for a moment. "We, received an anonymous tip about faulty wiring and unpermitted modifications." "An anonymous tip," Miller repeated, making a note in her pad. "And this anonymous tip couldn't wait until, say, 9 a.m.? And couldn't be addressed with a formal written notice, perhaps involving actual city code enforcement if it was a genuine safety hazard?" Skippy chimed in. "We tried yesterday. He refused us entry. He was being obstructive." Liam, who had remained quiet, spoke up. "Obstructive?" My father calmly explained his right to privacy and asked for a written, legal basis for their demand to enter his home. They couldn't provide one. "They just made vague threats." Miller looked at Liam, then back at me. "And you, sir?" She addressed Liam. "You were involved in a physical altercation?" "One of them," Liam said, nodding towards Big Tony, who was now slumped on my porch steps, "charged at me when he came through the door. I defended myself." Big Tony started to protest. "He attacked me. I was just doing my job." "Your job involves breaking down doors and charging at residents in their own homes before dawn?" Rodriguez asked, an eyebrow arched. His expression clearly communicated his skepticism. The story Brenda and her officers were trying to spin was so flimsy it was transparent. I showed the officers the email I'd sent to the HOA board late the previous night after Brenda's initial visit, CCing my personal lawyer, documenting her threats and my position on refusing entry without proper cause and due process. I was already laying a paper trail. It's what engineers do. We document everything. I knew she was unreasonable. I told Officer Miller, but I never imagined she'd resort to this. "This is criminal." Officer Miller sighed. "Ma'am," she said to Brenda, "what you've described as an HOA action looks a whole lot like breaking and entering, possibly criminal mischief, and your officers here," she eyed Tony and Skippy with disdain, "could be looking at assault charges, depending on Mr. Peterson and his son's statements." Brenda's face turned an interesting shade of mottled red and white, almost matching her puce tracksuit in its unpleasantness. "This is an internal HOA matter." "You have no jurisdiction," she blustered. Rodriguez chuckled, a short, sharp sound. "Ma'am, breaking down a door and accosting people in their home is a criminal matter. The HOA does not supersede state law. Your bylaws don't give you the authority to commit felonies." The word felonies seemed to finally penetrate Brenda's thick skull. She went very quiet. Big Tony looked like he was about to be sick. Skippy was visibly trembling. The police took detailed statements from everyone. Liam and I were factual, calm. Brenda, Tony, and Skippy's stories were a mess of contradictions and justifications that clearly didn't hold water. The officers documented the damage to my door with photographs, collected the fallen clipboard as potential evidence, and informed Brenda, Tony, and Skippy that a report would be filed and the district attorney's office would be reviewing the case for potential charges. They weren't arrested on the spot, much to my initial disappointment, but the officers made it clear they were not in the clear. As the police were wrapping up, several of my neighbors, drawn by the commotion and the flashing lights, had gathered at a respectful distance, whispering amongst themselves. I saw Mrs. Henderson from across the street, a sweet elderly lady who Brenda had recently terrorized over the color of her mailbox. It was beige, apparently an unapproved beige. I saw the Millers, a young couple who were fined for their children's laughter being too loud in their own backyard. Their faces held a mixture of fear and a dawning hope. Maybe, just maybe, the Queen's reign of terror was finally being challenged. After the police left, issuing a stern warning to Brenda and her cohorts not to approach me or my property, there was an awkward silence. Brenda, deflated and looking utterly spent, glared at me with pure hatred before turning on her heel and stalking off, her 2 officers trailing behind her like scolded puppies. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, indifferent light on the wreckage of my front door and the shambles of Brenda Clump's authority. Liam put a supportive hand on my shoulder. "You okay, Dad?" Shaken, I admitted, but furious and determined. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." I looked at my splintered door, a tangible symbol of their outrageous overreach. "They're going to pay for this, Liam. One way or another, they are going to pay." My mind was already whirring. This wasn't just about a broken door anymore. This was about abuse of power, about systematic bullying, about the perversion of what an HOA was supposed to be, a body to maintain community standards, not a private fiefdom for a petty tyrant. As a civil engineer, I'd spent my life building things, understanding structures, identifying weak points, and ensuring integrity. It was time to apply those skills to dismantling Brenda Clump's corrupt little empire. The first step was gathering every piece of evidence, every bylaw, every correspondence. I needed blueprints of her downfall, and I was going to draw them meticulously. The fear was morphing into a cold, hard resolve. My home, my sanctuary, had been violated. My son had been forced to defend us. Brenda Clump had declared war, and she had no idea how methodically I was about to fight back. My workshop, usually filled with tools for creation, was about to become the headquarters for a very different kind of project, the meticulous deconstruction of a local dictator. And as I surveyed the damage, I couldn't help a grim smile. She thought her security goons were tough. She hadn't counted on an MMA fighter in his pajamas. And she certainly hadn't counted on a retired engineer with a lifetime of experience in finding and exploiting structural weaknesses. Brenda Clump's structure was rotten to the core, and I was about to bring the whole damn thing crashing down. The days following the 5 a.m. raid were a blur of activity, fueled by righteous anger and copious amounts of coffee. The first order of business was securing my home. A local locksmith, a burly, sympathetic guy named Sal, came out within hours of the police leaving. He whistled when he saw the damage. "Heard about this," he said, shaking his head. "Oh, right? Some of them are nuts. This Brenda Clump, she's legendary." He installed a temporary, reinforced door and promised to get a new solid oak one ordered and fitted ASAP, complete with upgraded locks and a reinforced frame. "On the house," he said for the temporary fix. "Consider it a contribution to the cause. My mother-in-law lives in this development. She's terrified of that woman." This was the first inkling I had that my personal battle might resonate wider. Next, I meticulously documented everything. I took hundreds of photos of the damage from every conceivable angle. I got Liam to write a detailed statement of his experience, focusing on the aggressive entry of Big Tony and his own defensive actions. I saved copies of every email, every letter, every notice I'd ever received from the HOA, especially anything signed by Brenda Clump or referencing her community standards enforcement officers. I pulled out my copy of the Harmony Glen Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, a document thicker than a phone book for a small city, and began to read it with the focused intensity I once reserved for complex engineering schematics. I was looking for procedural violations, overreaches of authority, anything that demonstrated a pattern of misconduct. My civil engineering background, while not legal, had trained me to be detail-oriented, to understand regulations, and to spot inconsistencies or abuses of process. This was just a different kind of structural analysis. Liam, bless him, was a rock. He stayed for a few more days, his quiet, imposing presence a balm to my frayed nerves and an unspoken deterrent to any further immediate stupidity from Brenda's camp. He also had a modern approach to things. "Dad," he said, "you should get security cameras, good ones, and start recording any interaction with these people." He helped me pick out a system online, and we had it express shipped. Within 2 days, my property was bristling with discrete, high-definition cameras covering every approach. Any future visit from Brenda or her goons would be memorialized in glorious Technicolor. I also started talking to my neighbors, tentatively at first. I didn't want to seem like a rabble-rouser, but Sal's comment about his mother-in-law had planted a seed. I started with Mrs. Henderson, the sweet lady with the unapproved beige mailbox. I found her tending her roses, her face etched with worry. When I told her what had happened to me, her eyes widened, then filled with a sympathetic anger. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, "that woman is a terror. She fined me $200 because my beige was too creamy. I had to repaint it, and my arthritis makes painting so difficult." Then she leaned in conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I heard she only became president because the last election was, well, peculiar. Very few people actually voted. Ballots went missing, some said. That was interesting. A potentially flawed election?" I made a mental note. My next visit was to the Millers, the young couple fined for their children's laughter. Mark Miller, a software developer, listened intently, his jaw tightening as I recounted the raid. She threatened to call Child Protective Services on us. His wife, Sarah, said, her voice trembling, because our kids were creating a persistent noise nuisance, playing in our own yard on a Saturday afternoon. We paid the fine. We were scared. We're new here. We didn't want trouble. One story led to another. The elderly Mr. Abernathy, forced to tear down a small, perfectly legal tool shed because Brenda didn't like the look of it. The Rodriguez family, harassed for weeks because their son's basketball hoop was allegedly half an inch over the property line. It wasn't. A pattern emerged. Brenda Klump and her enablers on the board, a couple of spineless individuals named Janice Weatherspoon and Gary the Grinner Smalls, who apparently just rubber-stamped all of Brenda's edicts, were running Harmony Glen like a personal piggy bank and a testing ground for petty tyranny. Fines were levied arbitrarily, appeals were impossible, and any dissent was crushed with threats and further harassment. Her security force, Big Tony and Skippy, were not, as I soon discovered through some discreet online sleuthing and a few well-placed inquiries with a friend who worked at the state licensing board, licensed security personnel at all. They were just a couple of local bullies Brenda had hired off the books, likely paid with HOA funds siphoned through opaque, miscellaneous expenses categories in the budget I'd once idly glanced at. This was a bombshell. Operating an unlicensed security service, especially one engaging in forced entry and assault, was a massive liability for the HOA and potentially criminal for Brenda herself if she was knowingly directing unlicensed individuals and misrepresenting them as legitimate security. My internal systems check hunch was also bearing fruit. Several long-term residents recalled Brenda pushing for this vaguely worded right of entry amendment years ago, but it had been voted down. She was acting as if it had passed. The meticulous engineer in me was building a case, brick by evidential brick. I started a spreadsheet. Dates, incidents, bylaw violations, victim names, potential financial irregularities. I cross-referenced HOA meeting minutes, the few that were actually published, with the financial statements. There were discrepancies, unexplained expenditures under headings like community enhancement projects that never seemed to materialize. and a suspicious increase in legal consultation fees that coincided with periods when Brenda was particularly active in her crusades against residents. I even found out that the garish puce tracksuits Brenda favored and the navy windbreakers for her security were purchased through a company owned by Brenda's cousin. Small-time stuff maybe, but it painted a picture of nepotism and misuse of funds. This was no longer just about my broken door. This was about systematic corruption and abuse. And as the evidence mounted, so did my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for Mrs. Henderson's mailbox, for the Miller children's right to laugh, for Mr. Abernathy's tool shed. I was fighting for Harmony Glen. The quiet suburban streets hid a simmering discontent, and Brenda Clump, in her blind arrogance, had just given it a spark. She thought she was dealing with a retiring engineer content to tinker with lawnmowers. She was about to discover she'd poked a hornet's nest, and I was just the first one out. The next HOA general meeting was in 3 weeks. It was time to prepare for a different kind of structural integrity test. The mountain of evidence I was compiling was impressive, even to my own critical eye, but I knew I couldn't wage this war alone. Civil engineering taught me the importance of solid foundations and expert consultation. This situation screamed for legal firepower. I remembered a lawyer my late wife had used for a small business matter years ago, a sharp, tenacious woman named Carol Hathaway. Her firm specialized in various civil matters, and I recalled she had a reputation for not backing down from a fight. I called her office, and after a brief explanation to her paralegal, I secured an appointment for the following day. Walking into Carol's meticulously organized, if slightly cluttered, office felt like entering a sanctuary of calm competence. She was in her late 50s, with a keen intelligence in her eyes, and an air of someone who had seen it all and wasn't easily shocked. I laid out my story, starting with Brenda's initial visit, the demand for an internal inspection, my refusal, and then the horrifying 5 a.m. raid. I presented her with the photos of my shattered door, Liam's statement, my detailed notes on conversations with neighbors, my research into Big Tony and Skippy's lack of security licenses, and my initial suspicions about financial misdeeds and election irregularities. Carol listened patiently, occasionally making notes, her expression shifting from polite interest to raised eyebrows, then to a grim, focused intensity. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful look on her face. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice measured, "this is quite something. Most HOA disputes involve overgrown lawns or unapproved paint colors. This borders on criminal enterprise." That was a far stronger statement than I dared hope for. "The breaking and entering is clear-cut," she continued. "The assault on your son, even if he defended himself ably, is serious. The fact that these security officers are unlicensed is a huge problem for the HOA and for Brenda Clump personally, especially if she directed their illegal actions and misrepresented their status. The potential civil liability for property damage, emotional distress, and punitive damages is substantial." She then laid out a multi-pronged strategy. First, a strongly worded cease and desist letter to Brenda Clump and the HOA board, demanding they halt all harassment, acknowledge the illegality of the raid, and preserve all relevant records. Second, preparing a civil lawsuit against the HOA, Brenda Clump personally, Big Tony, and Skippy. The suit would claim damages for trespass, assault, battery, against Liam, intentional infliction of emotional distress, property damage, and, crucially, a claim under RICO statutes if we could firmly establish a pattern of racketeering activity, which the systemic misuse of funds and intimidation tactics were beginning to suggest. Carol's eyes lit up a bit at the mention of RICO. It was clear she relished a complex fight. "But a lawsuit takes time, Arthur," she warned. "And in the meantime, Brenda Clump is still in power. We need to address that." This led to the third prong, mobilizing the community for the upcoming HOA general meeting. "You have compelling evidence of her malfeasance," Carol said, "and you have frightened, angry neighbors. This is your opportunity for a grassroots takedown. We can use the threat of the lawsuit and the exposure of her actions to pressure her out, or to fuel a vote of no confidence and elect a new board. She then explained the finer points of HOA governance, the rules for calling special meetings, for removing board members, for inspecting financial records, rights that Brenda had clearly been trampling on. The key was empowering the residents with knowledge. While Carol prepared the legal barrage, my job was to rally the troops. I wasn't a natural organizer, more of a behind-the-scenes analyst, but the sheer injustice of it all, and the sight of my neighbors living in fear, spurred me on. I started holding discreet evening meetings in my living room, now with a newly installed steel-reinforced door and several cameras silently watching my front yard. At first, only a few brave souls came. Mrs. Henderson, the Millers, Mr. Abernathy. But as word spread, and as I shared some of the non-confidential aspects of Carol's legal assessment, like the unlicensed security bombshell, the numbers grew. People brought their own stories, their own meticulously saved fine notices for absurd violations, their own suspicions about where their HOA dues were really going. The smoking gun regarding the security team solidified beautifully. My friend at the state licensing board confirmed unequivocally no record of Big Tony, Anthony Rizzoli, or Skippy, Albert Finch, holding any security guard license. Furthermore, there was no licensed security agency registered to the Harmony Glen HOA or to Brenda Clump. They were, in legal terms, just a couple of hired thugs and cheap windbreakers. I even got an anonymous tip, likely from Sal, the locksmith's mother-in-law network, that Big Tony had a couple of minor assault charges from his younger days. Nothing that stuck, but enough to paint a picture of his temperament. Skippy, it turned out, was Brenda's nephew by marriage, a detail that screamed nepotism. And the kicker, I managed to get a copy of a canceled HOA check leaked by a disgruntled former board member who had quit in disgust months earlier, made out to Clump Cleaning and Community Care, Brenda's cousin's company, for security services. The amount was exorbitant for two unlicensed guys. This wasn't just incompetence, it was willful deceit and embezzlement. Carol was delighted. "This is gold, Arthur, pure gold." We decided to save this particular nugget for the HOA meeting, for maximum impact. In the meantime, Brenda, oblivious to the storm gathering around her, continued her reign. She had the audacity to send me a formal notice, via certified mail, fining me $500 for failure to maintain a secure entryway, my broken door, and another $200 for unauthorized surveillance equipment, my new security cameras. It was so absurdly arrogant it was almost comical. Carol immediately fired back a letter, threatening sanctions for witness intimidation and frivolous actions. Brenda also tried to intimidate other residents who were now seen talking to me. Mrs. Henderson received a violation for her bird bath having stagnant water, it was freshly filled. And Mark Miller got a notice that his trash cans were visible from the street for an excessive duration. He'd taken them out that morning for pickup. These petty harassments only fueled the residents' anger and strengthened their resolve. We were no longer a collection of isolated victims. We were becoming an army. My spreadsheet of grievances grew, alongside a list of homeowners willing to stand up and speak at the meeting. Liam, though back to his training schedule, called daily for updates. "Give 'em hell, Dad," he'd say. His presence during the raid had been a catalyst, showing everyone that Brenda's bullies weren't invincible. He planned to be at the HOA meeting, not to fight, but just to be there, a silent reminder of what Brenda had done. The countdown to the HOA meeting was on. I felt like I was preparing for a major engineering project presentation, but instead of blueprints for a bridge, I had charts of Brenda's misdeeds and a speech designed to dismantle her corrupt regime. The suburban quiet of Harmony Glen was about to be shattered again, not by breaking doors, but by the voices of its residents finally finding their courage. The night of the Harmony Glen HOA general meeting was electric. Usually, these affairs were sparsely attended, mostly by Brenda's sycophants and a few hardy gadflies she'd summarily dismiss. Tonight, however, the community clubhouse meeting room was packed to the gills. Word had spread like wildfire. People stood along the walls, filled every chair, and spilled out into the hallway. I saw faces I hadn't seen in years, neighbors who had long since given up on having any say in their own community. There was a palpable buzz in the air, a mixture of anxiety, anger, and a desperate, flickering hope. Liam was there, standing quietly at the back near me, his sheer physical presence a subtle counterpoint to the memory of Brenda's goons. He wasn't there to intimidate, but to support. His being there sent a clear message. This family doesn't back down. Brenda Clump, flanked by her quivering board enablers, Janice Weatherspoon, and Gary the Grinner Smalls, sat at the front table. Brenda was wearing a particularly garish floral pantsuit, her makeup a defiant mask, but I could see the tightness around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hand as she shuffled her papers. She looked out at the sea of faces, not with her usual condescending smirk, but with a dawning flicker of something that might have been unease. She banged her gavel, a little too loudly. "Order! Order! Welcome to the quarterly general meeting of the Harmony Glen Homeowners Association." She tried to launch into her pre-prepared agenda, a tedious recitation of mundane committee reports, but the crowd was restless. Mr. Abernathy, emboldened by the sheer number of supportive neighbors, was the first to speak out of turn. "Madam President," he called out, his voice surprisingly strong for his age, "we have more pressing matters to discuss than the petunia planting schedule." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Brenda's face hardened. "Mr. Abernathy, you are out of order. We will follow the agenda." "No, Brenda, we won't," I said, stepping forward. My voice was calm, but it carried through the room. All eyes turned to me. Carol Hathaway had coached me on this. Don't let her control the narrative. There are serious issues of malfeasance, abuse of power, and potential criminal activity by this board that need to be addressed immediately. Brenda's eyes shot daggers at me. "Mr. Peterson, you are not recognized. This is a campaign of slander. Security." She looked around wildly, as if expecting Big Tony and Skippy to materialize and drag me out. But Tony and Skippy were nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it they'd made themselves scarce after Carol's initial letter landed on their doorsteps, advising them to seek their own legal counsel. "Your security isn't here, Brenda," I stated. "Perhaps because they're unlicensed thugs who committed breaking and entering and assault under your direct orders? The same orders that led to my front door being smashed in at 5 a.m? A collective gasp went through the room. Many had heard rumors, but hearing it stated so baldly, so publicly, was different. I had a small projector set up, and with a click of a button, a photo of my shattered door filled the screen behind Brenda. Then a photo of Big Tony looking distinctly uncomfortable in his ill-fitting HOA security windbreaker. Brenda turned white. "This is an outrage. These are lies." "Are they, Brenda?" I continued, my voice gaining strength. "Is it a lie that Anthony Rizzoli and Albert Finch, your nephew, are not licensed security personnel in this state?" "I have confirmation from the state licensing board." I clicked again. A screenshot of the licensing board search results, "No records found," appeared. "Is it a lie that you authorized them to break down my door?" I then played a short audio clip. It was from my new security camera, catching a snippet of a conversation Brenda had on her cell phone on her porch the day after the raid, loudly complaining to someone that her idiot security team couldn't even handle one old man and his kid, even after I told them to do whatever it takes to get in. The quality wasn't perfect, but her distinctive, shrill voice was unmistakable. The room was dead silent, then erupted into angry murmurs. Brenda looked like she'd been slapped. "That's taken out of context. It's an illegal recording." "Actually, Brenda," Carol Hathaway's voice cut through the din as she stepped forward from the side of the room. "In this state, it's one-party consent for audio recording. If there's no expectation of privacy, and your front porch, where you were practically shouting, hardly qualifies as private. Besides, the issue here is your admission of directing an illegal act." Carol introduced herself as my legal counsel and briefly outlined the potential civil and even criminal liabilities Brenda and the HOA were now facing due to raid and the unlicensed security operation. Then it was the neighbors' turn. One by one, people stood up. Mrs. Henderson, her voice shaking but firm, recounted the mailbox harassment. Mark Miller spoke about the threats over his children's laughter. Mr. Abernathy detailed the arbitrary order to demolish his shed. Story after story painted a damning portrait of Brenda's reign: abuse of power, intimidation, financial opacity, and a complete disregard for the residents she was supposed to serve. I then presented the financial irregularities: the payments to clump cleaning and community care for security services, the unexplained community enhancement funds. The evidence was overwhelming. Janice Weatherspoon looked like she was about to cry. Gary Smalls was staring at his shoes, his usual grin wiped clean off his face. Brenda, however, tried to fight back, sputtering denials, accusing everyone of a conspiracy, of being jealous of her leadership. But her voice lacked its usual conviction. She was cornered, exposed, and the carefully constructed facade of her authority was crumbling. Finally, I made the motion. I move for a vote of no confidence in President Brenda Clump and board members Janice Weatherspoon and Gary Smalls, and for their immediate removal from office. A chorus of "seconded" rose from the crowd. According to HOA bylaws, such a vote required a 2/3 majority of members present. Hands shot up across the room. It was practically unanimous. Brenda stared, aghast, as the count was made. She was out. Janice and Gary were out. The relief in the room was so thick you could almost taste it. People were clapping, some were crying, others were shaking hands. In the ensuing organized chaos, an interim board was quickly nominated and elected from amongst respected, long-term residents known for their fairness. The first act of the new interim president, a retired accountant named Howard Lee, was to formally apologize to me and my son on behalf of the HOA, to announce the immediate termination of any agreements with Big Tony and Skippy and Clump Cleaning, and to pledge a full, transparent audit of the HOA's finances. The aftermath was swift. My lawsuit proceeded, but against a now cooperative HOA. They settled quickly, covering all my damages, legal fees, and a significant sum for the emotional distress and the egregious nature of the home invasion. Brenda Clump, however, was not so lucky. The HOA's insurance refused to cover her for acts deemed intentional and outside the scope of legitimate board duties. She was personally liable. Facing mounting legal bills and public disgrace, she sold her house, at a loss, I heard, and moved out of Harmony Glen within months. Big Tony and Skippy were indeed charged with misdemeanor breaking and entering and assault. They pleaded down to lesser charges, got probation and hefty fines. The district attorney's office even looked into Brenda for misuse of HOA funds and directing the unlicensed security, but the paper trail was just murky enough for her to escape criminal charges there, though her reputation was permanently destroyed. Harmony Glen changed. The new board was transparent, fair, and responsive. The ridiculous fines stopped. The atmosphere of fear lifted. People started talking to each other again, planting community gardens, holding block parties. My new front door, a beautiful solid oak, became a quiet symbol of the change. Liam still jokes about his 5 a.m. takedown, but is mostly just proud his old man stood up to a bully. Sometimes, I still can't believe how it all escalated from a refusal to let someone inspect my hedges. But as I sit on my porch now, in a genuinely harmonious Harmony Glen, watching kids laugh freely in their yards and neighbors chat over fences, I know it was worth it. It turns out, even a retired civil engineer can cause a few carefully planned demolitions when necessary. And that, folks, is how you not only get revenge on an HOA tyrant, but also help liberate an entire community. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a crazy HOA story of your own. I bet there are some wild ones out there. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because you never know when another tale of when keeping it real goes very, very right might just come your way.